Paul Castellano, 70 years old and the most powerful mob boss in America, stepped out of his black Lincoln Town car in front of Sparks Steakhouse in Manhattan. To him, it was just another routine dinner with his underboss, Thomas Bilotti. However, what he doesn't know is that 4 hitmen dressed in trench coats and Russian fur hats are positioned near the restaurant entrance. They've been waiting for this exact moment, ordered by his own capo, John Gotti, who's watching from a car across the street with a walkie-talkie in hand. As Castellano exits the vehicle at 5:26 p.m., the gunmen rush forward, shots ring out, multiple bullets strike Castellano's head and body. Bilotti falls seconds later beside the driver's door. This was the last time Paul Castellano would ever be seen alive.
The bullets that ended Big Paul Castellano's life last night may very well have been a payoff for getting into such trouble with the feds. As the reputed head of the crime commission and the godfather of the Gambino family, his appearance in court every day and the preoccupation with his defense were bad for business.
December 16th, 1985, Manhattan's Midtown. 2 men step out of a black Lincoln sedan in front of Sparks Steakhouse. Unaware, they have seconds to live. Paul Castellano wasn't just any mob boss. He was the boss of bosses, head of the Gambino crime family, one of New York's most powerful criminal organizations. Known as Big Paul, Castellano had succeeded Carlo Gambino in 1976, stepping into an empire built on concrete, construction, and intimidation. But Castellano ran the family like a businessman, not a gangster. He lived in a 17-room Staten Island mansion called the White House, wore silk robes and velvet slippers, and demanded his captains deliver cash-stuffed envelopes to his doorstep without ever being invited inside. His men hated him for it. Castellano saw himself as legitimate. He pushed white-collar rackets, concrete clubs, union control, construction monopolies. He banned drug dealing under threat of death, calling it too risky, too much federal heat. But for soldiers like John Gotti, heroin was where the real money was, and Castellano's rules, combined with his greed, his isolation, and his arrogance, had turned loyalty into resentment. By 1985, things were falling apart. Wiretaps exposed Gotti and his crew dealing drugs. Federal indictments were piling up. Castellano wanted transcripts of those tapes, and when he didn't get them, he hinted at dismantling Gotti's crew. Then came the final insult. When underboss Agnello Della Croce died in December, Castellano didn't attend the funeral. To Gotti, that was unforgivable. Worse, Castellano named his personal bodyguard, Thomas Bilotti, as the new underboss, passing over Gotti entirely. That's when Gotti made his move. 5:26 p.m. Castellano's car pulls up to Sparks Steakhouse. Traffic slows. A red light. Across the street, Gotti watches from a Lincoln sedan, walkie-talkie in hand. On the sidewalk, 3 hitmen in trench coats and Russian fur hats move into position. The light changes. Castellano's driver opens the door. The gunmen rush forward. 6 shots hit Castellano. 4 hit Bilotti. Both men collapse on the pavement in front of stunned holiday shoppers. The shooters vanish into the Manhattan streets. Gotti drives slowly past the bodies, just to make sure, then disappears into the night. The hit was brazen, and it worked. 2 weeks later, Gotti was crowned the new boss of the Gambino family. But Castellano's murder broke an unwritten rule. Gotti hadn't asked permission from the other families. Genovese boss Vincent Gigante was furious and personally ordered Gotti killed. The hit failed. Gotti survived. And for a time he became untouchable. The Teflon Don, larger than life, smiling for cameras, beating case after case. Until 1992. That's when Salvatore Gravano, Gotti's own underboss, the man who sat beside him the night they murdered Castellano, turned informant. Gravano's testimony convicted Gotti of racketeering, conspiracy, and 5 murders, including Paul Castellano's. Gotti was sentenced to life without parole. He died in prison 10 years later. No one else was ever charged for Castellano's death. The body of the boss of bosses was buried in a Staten Island cemetery, denied a Catholic funeral by the Archdiocese of New York. But if you think that was shocking, wait until you hear what happened when another mob boss thought he was untouchable.
When Al Capone walked the streets of Chicago, he towered over an organized crime enterprise that rewarded him with front row seats at big events. But when Scarface was eventually locked up on federal tax charges and housed here at the famous Alcatraz prison,
A colorful life with dark secrets. A life that came to a dramatic end at a Boston nightclub on January 24th, 1933.
January 25th, 1947. America's most notorious gangster took his final breath in his Florida mansion. Not from a rival's bullet, but from the disease he'd ignored for decades. Born to Italian immigrants in Brooklyn on January 17, 1899, Alphonse Capone seemed destined for an ordinary life. His father was a barber, his mother a seamstress. Nothing about young Al suggested he'd become the face of American organized crime. But the sixth grader who struck his teacher and walked out of school forever had just made his first choice toward infamy. By 14, Capone was working odd jobs: candy store clerk, bowling alley pinboy, while running with Brooklyn street gangs, the Junior 40 Thieves, the Bowery Boys, eventually the powerful 5 Points Gang. It was at a Coney Island dance hall called the Harvard Inn where everything changed. While working as a bouncer, Capone made a crude remark to a woman at the bar. Her brother, Frank Galluccio, slashed him 3 times across the left side of his face. The scars would become his calling card, though Capone hated the nickname Scarface and always claimed the wounds were war injuries. 1919. Capone married May Coughlin just weeks after their son was born, took an honest job as a bookkeeper in Baltimore, and seemed ready to go straight. But when his father died of a heart attack the next year, Johnny Torrio made him an offer he couldn't refuse: come to Chicago. Torrio was building an empire in gambling and prostitution, but the real gold mine appeared with Prohibition in 1920. Bootlegging would make millionaires of men who knew how to operate outside the law. Capone brought his street smarts and his way with numbers. Torrio promoted him to partner almost immediately. The operation flourished. By 1925, when Torrio barely survived an assassination attempt and fled to Italy, he handed the entire Chicago outfit to his protege. Capone was 26 years old. Unlike the low-profile Torrio, Capone embraced the spotlight. He moved into a plush suite at the Metropole Hotel, spent lavishly, always in cash to avoid paper trails, wore custom suits and expensive jewelry, told reporters, "I am just a businessman, giving the people what they want." The press ate it up. To many Americans, especially as resentment toward Prohibition grew, Capone wasn't a criminal. He was a rebel who worked on the side of the people. During the Depression, he even opened a soup kitchen for the unemployed. The public sympathy wouldn't last. Capone's rise came with a body count. He ordered rivals gunned down in the streets. Establishments that refused to buy his liquor got bombed. As many as 100 people died in such attacks during the 1920s. His feud with Joe Aiello saw multiple assassination attempts on both sides. Aiello put a $50,000 bounty on Capone's head. At least 10 gunmen tried to collect. All ended up dead. When 3 of his own men, Albert Anselmi, John Scalise, and Joseph Junta, were caught plotting against him, Capone allegedly beat them with a baseball bat at a dinner party before having them shot. Whether that's exactly how it happened remains debated, but the story spread. Fear was good for business. Then came the massacre that would change everything. February 14, 1929. 7 members of the rival North Side Gang were lined up against a garage wall at 2122 North Clark Street. Men dressed as police officers walked in, appearing to conduct a raid. The victims complied. Then the machine guns opened fire. The target, Bugs Moran, wasn't there that morning, but the execution of 7 men in broad daylight shocked the nation. Photos of the slain bodies hit every newspaper. Chicago looked like a war zone. Capone looked like a monster. He was in Florida when it happened, but everyone knew who was responsible. The press dubbed him Public Enemy Number 1. President Herbert Hoover ordered the federal government to take him down. The government couldn't prove Capone ordered the St. Valentine's Day Massacre or any of the other murders. But they had something else: tax evasion. By 1927, Capone's operation generated an estimated $100 million annually. He'd never paid income tax on any of it. When his lawyer tried to negotiate, he inadvertently admitted Capone's income: $100,000 for 1928 and 1929 alone. It was all the evidence prosecutors needed. On June 16, 1931, Capone was indicted on 22 counts of federal income tax evasion. He tried to plead bargain for a lighter sentence, but when Judge James Herbert Wilkerson refused to honor the deal, the case went to trial. October 17, 1931, he was guilty on 5 counts. Then, sentenced to 11 years in federal prison, fined $50,000 and held liable for $215,000 in back taxes. America's most powerful gangster was going to prison, not for bootlegging, not for murder, but for not paying his taxes. Capone entered Atlanta Penitentiary in May 1932. Within days, doctors diagnosed him with syphilis and gonorrhea. The syphilis had been progressing untreated for years. In August 1934, he was transferred to the newly opened Alcatraz. The isolation was designed to break him. No visitors, no contact with the outside world. His criminal empire continued without him, now run by Frank Nitti. Inside Alcatraz, Capone's mind began to deteriorate. Neurosyphilis, syphilis of the brain, was destroying him. He was permitted to play banjo in the prison band and even transcribe the song Madonna Mia as a tribute to his wife. But the confusion and disorientation grew worse. In 1938, his formal diagnosis confirmed what everyone could see. His brain was being eaten away by disease. November 16, 1939. After 7 years, 6 months, and 15 days, Capone was released. He had the mentality of a 12-year-old child. Johns Hopkins Hospital refused to treat him because of his reputation, but Union Memorial Hospital in Baltimore didn't turn him away. In 1942, he became one of the first Americans treated with the new miracle drug, penicillin. But it was too late to reverse the damage. Capone spent his final years at his Palm Island mansion in Miami, surrounded by his wife and grandchildren. The man who once ruled Chicago with an iron fist and a Tommy gun now spent his days confused and docile, unable to remember his crimes or his former power. January 25, 1947. Surrounded by family, his heart gave out. Al Capone died at 48, not from violence or assassination, but from a disease he'd contracted in his youth and never bothered to cure. The newspapers called it the end of an evil dream. But if you think Capone's death marked the end of Chicago's crime dynasty, you'd be wrong. The outfit he built would continue to evolve, and the next generation of bosses would learn from his mistakes. Some would be smarter about staying in the shadows, others would be even more brutal, and one boss in particular would meet an end even more dramatic than Capone's. Great for you, because that story is next. October 25th, 1957, Albert Anastasia leaned back in chair number 4 at the Park Sheraton Hotel barbershop. A hot towel draped across his face. His bodyguard had mysteriously disappeared. The Lord High Executioner, the man who'd orchestrated hundreds of murders through his enforcement arm, Murder Inc., was about to discover what every one of his victims had learned. 2 men with scarves covering their faces burst through the door. Anastasia's barber barely had time to step back before the gunfire erupted. The Mad Hatter lunged from his chair in confusion, stumbling toward the mirror as bullets tore through him. He collapsed on the barbershop floor in a heap, blood pooling beneath him. The most feared killer in mafia history, dead in the very chair where he came for a simple haircut. Umberto Anastasio arrived in America the hard way, jumping ship from a freighter in 1919 with nothing but ambition and a terrifying capacity for violence. He changed his name to Albert Anastasia and started working the Brooklyn waterfront, quickly discovering that fear paid better than honest labor. By the late 1920s, Anastasia had seized control of the Longshoremen's Union through intimidation and murder. Witnesses who might testify against him had a habit of disappearing or suddenly losing their memories. One witness who actually made it to the stand, he was granted a retrial in 1922 when 4 key prosecution witnesses vanished into thin air. Anastasia walked free. He wasn't just brutal, he was connected. He aligned himself with Giuseppe Masseria, then later with the rising stars of organized crime, Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, Vito Genovese, and Joe Adonis. These weren't friendships. They were strategic alliances built on mutual benefit and mutual fear. April 15, 1931, Anastasia helped orchestrate one of the most pivotal murders in mafia history. He was one of the gunmen who walked into Nuova Villa Tamaro restaurant and shot Giuseppe Masseria to death, while Masseria's own associate, Lucky Luciano, conveniently excused himself to the bathroom. The killing ended the Castellamarese War and reshaped the American mafia forever. As a reward for his loyalty, Luciano gave Anastasia control of something unprecedented, a professional murder squad. Alongside Louis Lecca Buchalter, Anastasia ran Murder Inc., operating out of the back room of a Brooklyn candy store. This wasn't street thuggery. This was corporate killing. They employed contract hitmen who shot, stabbed, strangled, and garroted targets across the country. Murder Inc. was linked to at least 63 confirmed murders, though the real number was likely far higher. Anastasia personally carried out about 30 of them. He didn't just order hits, he got his hands dirty. March 8, 1952. Arnold Schuster, a 24-year-old clothing salesman, made a fatal mistake. He spotted fugitive bank robber Willie Sutton on a New York subway and called the cops. Sutton was arrested. Schuster became a media hero, appearing on television to tell his story. Anastasia saw the interview and reportedly exploded. "I can't stand squealers. Hit that guy." Weeks later, Schuster was gunned down on a Brooklyn street. The murder shocked the city. Schuster wasn't involved in organized crime, wasn't a witness against the mob, wasn't anything but a civilian who did his civic duty. Anastasia had him killed anyway, simply because he hated informants in principle. It was reckless, it was unnecessary, and it terrified everyone, including his fellow mobsters. By 1957, Anastasia had made himself untouchable in all the wrong ways. He'd risen from underboss to boss of what would become the Gambino crime family after Vincent Mangano mysteriously disappeared in 1951. Everyone knew Anastasia had ordered the hit, but no one dared say it out loud. But power made him sloppy. Anastasia started breaking sacred mafia rules. He was selling memberships into his crime family for $50,000 each, a blatant violation that infuriated other mob leaders. He was losing huge sums betting on horse races, making him erratic and unpredictable. His brutality, once an asset, now seemed like a liability that could bring unwanted law enforcement heat down on everyone. Vito Genovese saw an opportunity to take control of the Luciano family. He needed to eliminate Frank Costello, but Costello and Anastasia were close allies. Taking out Costello meant taking out Anastasia too. Genovese quietly built his case. He pointed to the Schuster murder, an insane hit that served no purpose. He highlighted the family membership sales. He emphasized how Anastasia's volatility threatened the entire commission. And crucially, he found a traitor inside Anastasia's own organization. Carlo Gambino, Anastasia's underboss, was offered a deal. Help eliminate Anastasia and you'll become boss of the family. Gambino said yes. October 25th, Anastasia left his Fort Lee mansion and headed to Manhattan. His bodyguard chauffeur, Anthony Coppola, drove him to the Park Sheraton Hotel, then, inexplicably, left him unguarded. Anastasia entered Arthur Grasso's barbershop in the hotel lobby and settled into chair number 4. Joseph Bocchino draped a cloth over him and began cutting his hair. Anastasia relaxed, chatting casually. That's when 2 men with scarves covering their faces walked in. They shoved Bocchino aside and opened fire. The first volley struck Anastasia from behind. In a moment of confusion or instinct, he lunged from the chair toward the mirror, either trying to fight back against his own reflection or desperately seeking his attackers. The gunman kept firing. One bullet lodged in the left side of his brain. Another penetrated his kidney, lung, and spleen. Anastasia crashed into the mirror, then collapsed onto the floor in a fetal position. The Mad Hatter, the man who'd evaded the electric chair, who'd strangled and shot his way to the top of the underworld, who held New York City in fear for decades, died on a barbershop floor at 10:20 a.m. The killers calmly walked out. They were never caught. The murder generated massive public interest and a high-profile police investigation, but no one was ever charged. The NYPD concluded that Vito Genovese and Carlo Gambino had arranged the hit, likely carried out by members of the Profaci crime family led by Joe Gallo. Years later, Gallo would boast to an associate about his role, calling the hit team the Barbershop Quintet. But officially, the case remains unsolved. His family fled to Canada the following year and changed their surname entirely. As for the barbershop, it eventually became a Starbucks. The chair where Anastasia died was refurbished, passed through collectors including comedian Henny Youngman, and eventually ended up on display at the Mob Museum in Las Vegas. Bloodstains scrubbed away, chrome polished, upholstery replaced. The artifact is authentic but sanitized, much like the legend of Albert Anastasia himself. Carlo Gambino officially took control of the family at a mob meeting shortly after the assassination, transforming it into what would have become one of the most powerful mafia organizations in American history. the Gambino crime family. But if you think betrayal gets more brutal than that, wait until you see what happens when loyalty becomes a death sentence. January 28, 1975. Frank Lucas's New Jersey home was swarmed by federal agents and local detectives. Over $500,000 in cash was seized. This was the fall of Harlem's most notorious drug kingpin, a man whose name echoed through the streets and whose empire was built on a ruthless gamble. Frank Lucas, born in 1930 in LaGrange, North Carolina, was no ordinary criminal. By the late 1960s, he controlled New York's heroin trade, directly importing massive amounts of pure heroin from Southeast Asia. He famously cut out the middlemen. Lucas claimed he smuggled heroin tucked inside the coffins of American servicemen killed in Vietnam. Though this claim has been fiercely disputed, the myth alone cemented his legend. Known on the streets as the mastermind behind Blue Magic, his product was said to be nearly pure, making it dangerously addictive and fattening his profits. Lucas grew up in the Jim Crow South, a harsh environment that shaped his dark path. He was driven by a traumatic memory, the brutal killing of his 12-year-old cousin by the Ku Klux Klan. His early years were marked by violence and petty crime, from mugging drunks to stealing thousands from an employer. When the law caught up, his mother urged him to flee north, fearing a deadly fate. Harlem was his destination, and there, his criminal ambitions ignited. Under the shadow of Harlem's godfather, Bumpy Johnson, whom Lucas claimed as a close mentor, Lucas honed his street smarts. After Johnson died in 1968, his path was clear to seize control of Harlem's underground networks. But instead of working with the Italian mafia, which had long dominated heroin distribution, Lucas took a bold risk. He struck a direct deal overseas. Reportedly, during trips to Bangkok, he connected with Leslie Ike Atkinson, a former U.S. Army sergeant running heroin sales to black soldiers. Together, they sourced heroin from the Golden Triangle, where opium was cultivated and refined, and Lucas brought it straight to Harlem. This cut the mafia out and allowed him to flood the streets with pure heroin, sold at higher prices under the Blue Magic brand. Lucas's operation was ruthless and meticulously controlled. He trusted mainly family and close associates from North Carolina to run the trade, minimizing theft and betrayal. His heroin was so pure, it outclassed competitors for potency, dominating the New York drug market, especially around 116th Street. Lucas claimed to be pulling in up to $1 million a day at his peak, a vast empire built on cunning and fear. But the boldness that built his empire also made him a prime target. Lucas was brazen, but also violent. He once admitted to shooting a rival dealer 4 times in broad daylight. The streets of Harlem knew his name, feared, respected, and hated. But criminal empires built on blood and drugs rarely last forever. The raid on his home was the start of the end. The police had been piecing together his sprawling network for years. The 1975 bust shocked the city, but was only the tip of the iceberg. Despite attempts by Lucas and his allies to intimidate witnesses, 2 died mysteriously before court. The evidence was overwhelming. He was convicted of federal and state drug trafficking charges and sentenced to a staggering 70 years in prison. Yet, Lucas played his cards well. Within 5 years, he flipped. Using his insider knowledge, he helped law enforcement dismantle scores of narcotics operations and expose corrupt officials. This cooperation earned him a sharp sentence reduction and protective custody for himself and his family. Though arrested again in the 1980s for new drug offenses, he never returned to the empire's peak he once ruled. Lucas's life after prison was quieter, but no less complicated. He lived in the Newark area, using a wheelchair due to a car accident, and even pleaded guilty in 2012 to a minor federal fraud charge related to disability payments. Despite his criminal past, he tried to leave a different legacy, writing an autobiography dedicated to helping kids avoid his mistakes. The myth of Frank Lucas became Hollywood gold in 2007 with Ridley Scott's American Gangster. Denzel Washington portrayed Lucas, injecting charisma into a gritty criminal saga. Yet critics and former law enforcement challenged the film's accuracy, calling many of Lucas's stories fabrications, especially the coffin smuggling myth. Still, the film cemented Lucas as an icon of the American drug underworld. Ultimately, Frank Lucas's story is a cautionary tale of ambition, crime, and survival. He rose from poverty with jaw-dropping innovation, broke mafia dominion, and built a narcotics empire that corroded communities and devastated lives. His downfall, and later cooperation, would end his reign but not erase the brutal damage left in his wake. Lucas died on May 30th, 2019 in New Jersey at 88. A man who haunted Harlem streets, toppled the mafia's grip, and whose legend still sparks debate about crime, power, and survival in America's darkest corners. Frank Lucas's daring gambit eventually crossed the line into a war he couldn't win. But if you think his story was the final word on Harlem's underworld, just wait. Next, we dive into someone whose mistakes were even more deadly. June 20th, 1947, Bugsy Siegel, once the kingpin of Los Angeles and a driving force behind the birth of Las Vegas, sat comfortably at Virginia Hill's Beverly Hills home as he read the newspaper in the luxurious living room, carefully chosen for both its style and secrecy. Night had already fallen heavily over the city. That calm evening would mark the end of an era and the start of the legend. Benjamin Bugsy Siegel was once a poor Jewish kid from Brooklyn's tough neighborhoods. He rose through the underworld ranks thanks to a blend of violence, intelligence, and a daring ambition rarely seen in organized crime. By the late 1920s, he had partnered with his childhood friend Meyer Lansky to form the Bugs and Meyer Mob, running bootleg liquor and racketeering gigs across New York. Siegel was known as much for his sharp suits and Hollywood connections as for bursts of terrifying violence. Friends claimed he was crazy as a bedbug, hence the nickname Bugsy, which he absolutely hated. His quick temper was legendary, but so was his boldness. In 1931, Siegel allegedly joined Charles Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, Albert Anastasia, and Vito Genovese in assassinating competing mob boss Giuseppe "Joe the Boss" Masseria. The hit cemented Luciano's, and by extension Bugsy's, clout in the underworld. By the 1930s, Siegel had become more than just another gangster. Flush with cash and confidence, he made Hollywood connections, wearing the sharpest clothes and living in a Waldorf Astoria Towers apartment. It was here he mingled with the likes of Clark Gable and Cary Grant, while also running extortion rackets that drained thousands from the local movie studios and production companies. In 1937, Siegel's empire changed coasts. National mob leaders wanted a bigger presence out west, and they knew Bugsy was the man for the job. He moved to Los Angeles, quickly outmaneuvering Jack Dragna, who had previously controlled the LA rackets. Dragna was forced to stand down as Siegel built up gambling dens and floating casinos just offshore, all while continuing his violent reputation. He even eliminated Harry Greenberg, a mob informant, along with his own brother-in-law, Whitey Krakow, who knew too much about the Greenberg hit. But even with all this criminal power, Bugsy Siegel loved the Hollywood lifestyle. Lavish Beverly Hills mansions and star-studded parties became his calling card. He mingled with the city's most beautiful women, including Countess Dorothy Dendice Taylor de Frasso, whose European connections introduced Siegel to Benito Mussolini, and, briefly, Hermann Goering and Joseph Goebbels. Siegel considered taking out the Nazi leaders, but the Countess wisely talked him out of it. Siegel's ambitions, however, extended far beyond California. In the mid-1940s, he saw an opportunity in the desert, the sleepy Nevada town of Las Vegas. He heard about the stalled Flamingo Hotel project. Its construction halted due to a lack of funding. Siegel convinced his mob associates that he could finish the Flamingo for only $1 million more than the projected $1.2 million budget. They agreed, seeing the potential for massive profits. The reality became very different. Construction costs soared, due in part to Siegel's mismanagement and girlfriend Virginia Hill's notorious skimming. The hotel ultimately cost $6 million by opening, a staggering loss and a serious breach of underworld trust. When the fancy opening in December 1946 bombed, with heavy rains keeping Siegel's Hollywood friends away, the casino lost $300,000 in its first weeks. Nearly all of it paid out to lucky gamblers. Although the Flamingo eventually turned a profit by spring 1947, the damage was done. Siegel's mob partners were furious at both the staggering cost overruns and his betrayal of trust. According to many reports, a key 1946 meeting in Havana among national crime syndicate leaders, including Siegel's childhood friend Meyer Lansky, sealed his fate. That brings us back to the night of June 20th, 1947. Siegel, still oblivious to the immediate danger, relaxed at Virginia Hills Mansion. At 10:45 p.m., an unknown assailant fired a .30 caliber rifle through the window. Of 9 shots, 4 found their mark. One destroyed the bridge of Siegel's nose and blew out his left eye. Another hit his cheek and exited the back of his neck. 2 others struck his chest, killing him instantly. His companion, Alan Smiley, was only grazed. Though the murder was never officially solved, most believe that the mob's ruling council ordered Siegel's death for his financial mismanagement and suspected skimming from the Flamingo Project. Others have proposed variations of this story, including the possibility that Matthew Moose Panza, in love with Mo Sedway's wife, killed Siegel to prevent him from executing Sedway, a mob figure tasked with watching the Flamingo's finances. The day after the murder, Siegel's associates Gus Greenbaum and Mo Sedway walked into the Flamingo and calmly took control, a move clearly orchestrated long in advance. Siegel's brutal demise sent a powerful message to anyone in organized crime. Nobody was bigger than the organization. Bugsy Siegel may not have invented Las Vegas, but his death made it famous. Scholar Robert Lacey perhaps said it best. Ben Siegel did not invent the luxury resort casino. He did not found the Las Vegas Strip. He did not buy the land or first conceive the project that became the Flamingo. But by his death, he made them all famous. The life and death of Bugsy Siegel reflected both the promise and peril of early Las Vegas. Ambition brought him fame, fortune, and eventually the city's birth. But betrayal, real or perceived, brought swift and certain retribution. His violent end became the cornerstone of Sin City's legend.